Ousmane Sembéne, for me, is a duty to perpetuate African memory and African stories. I think Jason came in about 15 years ago, and we became twins, as you can see, actually, we look alike. So what we just showed that really, at the time when the world is being dominated by global media and commercial media, that you can make a difference in the world. Just bringing love. We met a few years ago. He was running films in Santa Fe. I was teaching in Massachusetts, and then it was just like a spark. An idea emerged. It took us 7 years to put it together, which is a story of Ousmane Sembéne, which we hope you will enjoy and will share with children.
Thank you, Samba. I just want to say we've shown the film around the world. This is the first time we've shown it in a theater with stained glass windows. We're really happy about it. This place is amazing. I'm already completely in love with the sanctuary for independent media. I think if there was one of these in each city in America, we'd probably live in pretty much a perfect union. So I hope you guys all support this place and come and tell your friends and do what you can to keep it thriving, because Sembene would have loved this place. I think of him as the world's greatest media activist, and you'll see why over the next, what is it, 88 minutes, and then we'll be here to talk with Igor. So keep those questions, and thank you guys so much for being here.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what you think that we can learn from this Sembene's films about this current moment where there's this big kind of the new kind of colonization, the land rush, the land grabbing that's happening all over Africa. What lessons do you think we can take from these films to this new kind of world in which everything's being chopped up, this sort of capitalist world where there's kind of like US, Europe, and China all kind of trying to get their claws into the continent?
Sam's going to answer the geopolitical part better than I will, but I think, the first lesson that's important from Sembene is that the stories we tell matter. That the stories he was telling weren't being told, and essentially that space had been yielded. And the stories that are told from neighbor to neighbor or through books, through our media, through our schools, those are what shape our understanding of the world. And if you're in a place where all the stories are coming from elsewhere, you're not going to understand where you're from. And so that leaves those communities especially vulnerable, because they start losing touch with their land, they start losing touch with their neighbors, with their communities, and so they're more vulnerable to the things you're talking about. Their sense of shared identity has been fractured. So anyway, that's my start.
Yeah, I think there are many issues here that are intertwined, if I may say. You have the cultural issue, Africans having lost their voices and their culture through the process of colonization. And I think, I don't want to make this of a scholarly seminar, but very well articulated by another commentator, Edward Said, who clearly indicated that to colonize a people, it is not just the taking of land. Maybe land can be reconquered, can be recovered, but the most pernicious enterprise is also to take away their culture. After 1885, when Europe divided Africa, as if it was terra incognita, that we did not have any cultures. So that culture, that looting of the economic wealth, that looting of the minerals, that looting of the agricultural products that were meant to rebuild Europe, reduced to ashes after World War II, that can be only done if Africans themselves are implicated within the process. How? By brainwashing them. I personally grew up at a moment when we went to school 4 hours a day. We absorbed through a lot of French culture, a lot of French literature. But once we left school, we went back home, we stepped back into our cultures. We stepped back into our languages. The elders still told us stories. But what is happening today is even more dangerous than what happened in 1885 when the continent was being divided. You could see the enemy. You could see the political, economic, and social apparatus at work. Now what has been more dangerous, under the presence of globalization, we are showered, completely drowned in Africa through Hollywood, through CNN, through Fox, for those who get it. Stories that are completely emptying us of ourselves. You have seen in the film Sembene saying, if Africa does not recover its stories, Africa is going to disappear. That is a challenge. And it is within that general situation of Africa losing itself that Sembene intervened. Jason and I call him a freedom fighter who used a camera as his weapon, basically.
Thank you.
I was really pleased to see this movie. I went to college in 1963 and graduated in 1967. And I went to Syracuse University, which had a graduate school of citizenship. And the US government sponsored a great number of Black Africans to come because they were going to be the head of the education department of Nigeria and the head of this and the head of that. And it was a really exciting time. There were very few of us white people at Syracuse University who actually talked to the Black students of the School of Citizenship. But I was fortunate enough to be pulled in, and so I knew a few people. But it all disappeared from me by 1973 or 74. And I never figured out what really had happened, except that we were so full of excitement for Africa, and then things didn't seem to work out, and then we just sort of turned away, because we didn't want to see things not working out, and nobody else was interested. So this was such a wonderful film, because I understood a whole lot more. So I wanted to thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You know, I can say that, oh, you have a question, great.
I have one question. On the later films that we saw, I think that were like in the late 80s or mid 80s and 90s, I would assume those were also banned in Senegal?
Yes, many of Sembene's films, the first Sembene film, actually just this evening I was showing a film in my class that was made in 1964, which Sembene never showed because of self-censorship. It's called Nyai. His first film is Borom Saret, which you saw here in the documentary, meaning the urbanization, the proletarization of Africans, and so on and so forth. Then you have a kind of flashback, where Sembene, in a certain way, to paraphrase Chinua Achebe, was showing us where the rain started beating us. How come African societies, under the double yoke of outside forces and of regressive internal traditional forces, that Africa completely lost its hopes. That film was not censored, but Sembene himself censored it because he thought it was a film that African people were not ready to see yet. But after that, he made Emitai in 1971 about the forced conscription of Africans into World War II, banned by France. Then he did Chetdo in 1976 about Islam and slavery, banned by Senegal. Then in 1986, he made a Kando Charoy about, again, the massacre of African soldiers after World War II, banned. So which means that throughout his film career, Sembene has been in conflict with powers to be. Why? Just because he had an oppositional discourse. You would read a lot of textbooks about World War II. Maybe just in passing you would hear about the participation of Africans in that World War II. Sembene wanted to break such silence because Western historiography has lied about the truth of what colonization was. So since Sembene projected himself as a griot, a storyteller for him had a very precise function, two roles. If you decide to speak, you speak in the name of truth and in the name of justice. Because, of course, of those two guiding principles of his work, he has always been, well, they always try to silence him, basically.
Thank you very much.
No, I was going to ask, I mean, there was ways other than censorship that his films, his filmmaking career was limited too, right?
It's true. It was as people say, well, Sembene was so preeminent in Senegal, but not so that he had to become untouchable. That's only at the surface level, because the reality is, after he made it, before even starting the idea of a Ceddo, the film of his life was about the resistance to French colonization in Africa. The film project he called Samori. He worked on it 35 years. He was never able to make that film because, truth be told, most of his films were financed by France. But of course, with that film, which was again going to show a dark page of French history in its relationship to the colonies, the film was never made.
He made 5 films in his first 11 years, and then he made 2 films over the next 16 years.
Exactly. Yeah.
After he was at the height of his career at that point.
Exactly. He was not, I would not say completely silenced, but really, since the French, by and large, held the purse, financed his films, of course, most of the time when he came with what they considered a subversive subject, they refused to fund the film. Well, at the end of his life, he tried to mitigate that a little bit by really shifting gears. While I would say his first 6 to 10 films were produced and edited in France. The last 15 years of his film, this dream he had in his mind of African unity, of Pan-Africanism, he implemented it through his art. By what doing? By creating not a North-South collaboration, but a South-South collaboration.
It was an all-star crew and cast from
Exactly.
Moolaade, that last film, from all across West Africa.
Right. If you take
It was edited in Africa,
Yeah.
which is rare.
It is very rare. For instance, Moolaade, the latest film, was edited not in France, but in Morocco. And the actors came from 5 African countries. Except the camera and his assistant, all the crew came from West African countries. Sembène wanted to make a demonstration. Since 1963, when most Africans had gained independence, we had this dream of an African unity. And in 63, actually, they had voted the creation of an African unity in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. But it remains only on paper. Sembène wanted to demonstrate that artistically, when there is a political will, there is a way of doing it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, sure, you're welcome.
I really want to thank you for bringing this amazing film here, because I know what I was going to say is, when I was younger, when I finished college, I went into the Peace Corps and I went to Nigeria. And unfortunately, during that time, the Civil War broke out, and I was on the eastern part, which became Biafra. But because of my experience, I didn't want to leave. So, I had to leave there, but I went to another country. At that time, it was Tanzania.
Mm-hmm.
So altogether, I was about 3.5 years, both in these 2 countries and then traveling. But the positive part of that period to me was that there was an amazing cultural renaissance. And Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, so many of the countries really created, I'm thinking of some of the great authors during that time, great music, great authors, now, learning more about filmmakers. And so for many years I followed this, but where do you see things stand now, both in terms of where many of these African countries are going, what's the dynamics there? Are there things, very creative things going on that many of us are not aware of? So just kind of...
Yeah, I think this, whatever response I give you here is really going to be reductive, because the problem is very, very complex. As we show in our documentary, the 60s were really years of great hope and enthusiasm. Whether you take Ghana, or you take Kenya, you take Guinea, we had really these heroes of independence who had a vision. Many of them were trained in the West, by the way. Kwame Nkrumah had his education here. Yeah. They all went back to Africa full of hope for nation building and the building of the African unity. That economic and political hope was also accompanied by a cultural revival. Case in point, the 1966 World Festival of Black Art held in Dakar. It was a moment of hope. Then 3 years later, the same festival was held in Lagos. Then another one was held in Algeria or Tunisia. But then, in my view, things started going wrong in the 80s. You mentioned the Peace Corps, right? Created by Kennedy, young Americans to go exchange with African people, to bring technical advice and so on and so forth. But the turning point really was in the beginning of the 80s when the International Monetary Fund intervened. If the International Monetary Fund had started working in Africa when I was young, I would never be facing you here because I'm a product of public education. My parents were farmers. My farmer made more than $20 a year, and yet I was able to do a PhD at the University of Illinois because of taxpayers' money from back home. Farmers, fishermen, and subsidized by the state. But with the wild, heartless privatization imposed by the International Monetary Fund on the presence of efficiency, productivity, everything went south. All the infrastructure, cultural infrastructure went down, the education went down, and I think Africa is still to recover if you calculate our foreign debt. Vicious system. The West goes there, help us initiate projects, but it is done in such a way you wonder who is developing whom. One last case in point, just one example. Lately, Senegal, my country, came up with a project of a rail system, right? Or an emerging Senegal plan. Billions of euros borrowed from abroad. But the reality is that those dollars, they don't leave the West. They are used first to buy the Western technology, to hire Western experts, and finally, we pay the debt. So basically, if you ask me what happened, if I have to put a marker in it, I would say all the dreams were dashed starting in the 80s when International Monetary Fund and the World Bank intervened in Africa.
No, I just think, what you're saying makes all the sense in the world because the period that I experienced was the greatest writers. The great, the creativity and the expression of indigenous culture was just, it was remarkable. But then you get the money people and they get involved and they buy off the leaders. And during the time, some of the greatest leaders in African history. I just feel like, I was very fortunate during that time. So it's a long road ahead now for Africa for these countries to become truly independent because so many of it, like you say, they're tied to the big imperialist countries, including the United States.
You mentioned Nigeria. You had Chinua Achebe.
Oh, yes.
You had Wole
Soyinka.
You had Senghor. You had Amadou Hampateba. You had
Yes.
all the, it was really a cultural revival.
Yes, it was.
And you don't think there's good writers now emerging?
No, there are, but they're all in the West.
Yes, that's the problem. They
all migrated to
Yes.
the West.
Yes.
And also the scholars. And look who's talking. I am here, subsidized by the farmers of Senegal. But when you look at it, I arrived here at the University of Illinois in 1982, graduate student, $300 a month. Who subsidized whom? Right. So you have all this phenomenon of a brain drain.
Yes.
At the surface level, yes, we are subsidizing development in Africa, but in reality, it is Africa that is subsidizing the West.
Exactly.
There's another question.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'll
thanks.
stop. Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering where else you've shown this film and what the different reactions have been based on, have you noticed any trends with age groups or other demographics?
What was your reaction? Okay, good. Okay, good.
No, it's
Based on your demographic, we get 2 thumbs up.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting question. Jason and I spent 7 years making this film, literally on our knees, because it was like, I'm a scholar, I'm not a filmmaker by training. He's a programmer, he's a writer. At least he knew a little bit about the film industry. So imagine a little bit, a blind leading a one-eyed. For 7 years, we're limping along, but we knew this story needed to be told. Just the fundraising. Any institution you go to, oh yes, we want to make a film. Oh, what is your film about? Ousmane Sembéne. Ousmane who? In the United States, because he is not a household name. He is not a Hollywood item, so also. But the rewarding thing is, since the film came out, how many festivals?
Lots.
Lots. We started at the Sundance Film Festival. And the irony is, until age 12, I had never seen a moving picture. At age 53, 55, we were competing at Sundance.
Well, one of our DVD extras has an interview with Samba, and he said the first time there was a radio brought to the village, he was walking around it trying to figure out where the person speaking was.
That's all my generation. But then we went to Sundance, we were nominated for the Camera d'Or in Cannes, and then we went to maybe about 50 or 100 festivals. But there was something missing. Africa was missing. We could not see the film in Africa. Well, last year we had an initiative we called Sembène Across Africa, which you saw here at the watermark on the film.
Sorry about that.
In 72 hours, we were able to screen the film in 38 African countries in more than 100 venues exactly like this.
Yeah, cafes and churches and
culture,
elementary schools.
Cultural centers, elementary school. Thanks to grants from Sundance and from Ford Foundation, we managed to, partially at least fulfill, at least symbolically, Sembene's dreams to reconcile the African artists with the African power.
It was such an exciting project, too.
It is exciting project. Imagine, I mean, for us, our favorite audience is you. Yes, I'm in the academic settings. We take Sembene's film, we theorize them, we dissect them, we write books about them. I wrote books about Sembene before making the film. You know how much I got in royalties from Indiana University Press this year? $57. But here we have what? At least 80 people watching the film in one setting. So to respond to your question, we have had a lot of audiences, but our audiences, by choice, is to bring our film to communities. Because it is not just a film about entertainment. Sembene called his films evening schools. We want to use this example to inspire young artists. That for us, being an artist, it is not just being on a red carpet and the bling bling and whatever you call it. You have to be an artist with a conscience. You have to participate in uplifting your society. And I think the most gratifying thing for Jason and I in the last 3.5 years is to be in Europe, be in the United States, even in Asia. I mean, the film has been seen in more than 100 countries, but last year the community screenings were the screenings the most important. So we hope when you go, you will tell your friend, you saw your film on Sambène, and you encourage that friend also to see a screening of the film in our communities.
And we're doing it again this year. And we're gonna show one of Sembene's features, and we're gonna do it the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. So and there'll be an infrastructure so other African filmmakers can connect their films with communities too.
We created a database of all the sites where we screened. You want to screen a film of this kind in Africa tomorrow? Just send us an email. It's already there. The community structure is already.
You know, this is the Sanctuary for Independent Media, and I want to just say something about how we put this together is we basically did it through micro grants. We raised money, and we gave that money and a DVD or a download link to, you know, whatever community wanted it. And so, you know, a lot of NGOs and cultural institutions, European or American cultural institutions in Africa, are all top down.
Yes.
So, you know, they tell the communities how to receive this material. And we basically said, here's some money, tell us what you're going to use the money for, but use the money as best you can to reach as many people and make it a meaningful experience for them. Here's a link, you know, here's some marketing assets. Well, whatever we can do to help you, we'll help you, but you know your communities, you know what's best. And so people took the film, and they, one nonprofit radio station took the film, and they did a seminar on the radio prior to the screening, then they did this screening, then they broadcast a Q&A afterwards, and then they did a live music party. An art school used it for their graduation ceremony. An educational organization in Senegal built a full-day seminar with educational programs. Teaching kids how to use cameras, and then show the film. So there was, you know, that was the cool thing is, and it's not about our film necessarily, it's just the idea of how do you connect these stories with people and have them be useful to the people who are receiving it. And everyone knows how to do that. I mean, we all used to tell stories communally. And even though these stories are now projected from, you know, centralized locations far away from our homes, it's ingrained in us. These sharing stories is ingrained in us, and it's too rare that we get together in a room like this and talk. And so that's what this experiment proved, is that there's a great desire for that.
Yeah, one experiment, for instance, I think it was in Malawi. We showed it in June, but it happened to be the coldest season in Malawi. They did not have any indoor theater. What did they ask us to give them? To give them wood stoves, so they can make wood, and then buy them blankets. They make an open air theater right away, improvise it, and they did it. And this year, one of the most renowned rappers in Senegal is going to promote the film and bring in all the progressive musicians to come watch it. So we thought just our really desired audience is the people that Sembène had targeted, how to reconcile the artists with the people who are destined to consume those products.
Yeah, and another note on that is that Sembène wanted to do all of this stuff, but you know, the opportunities to do that were limited, because when you're working with 35 millimeter film and 35 millimeter projectors, it's really onerous. I mean, how do you do that? How do you connect people with these films? You have to, you know, it's a whole day to set that up, and then you can show it to as many people come. With digital technology, you know, you can do it everywhere instantaneously. And actually, we made a partnership with Vimeo for this project, and
Netflix.
No, with the Vimeo. With Vimeo. And Vimeo, I know if you guys watch Vimeo, you know, it will automatically roll over to another film after you're done watching your film, or give you a suggestion of what to watch. They made our documentary the next film for everything that anyone watched for that 72-hour period. So over the course of 72 hours, 2.4 million people watched the film. An African film. So it was probably, you know, more people watched African cinema in that 72 hours than probably the entire, you know, history of African cinema for the 50 years before.
Yeah, but what is also fascinating is how much did it cost for the project to do that, to reach all these millions of people?
Nothing. I mean, you know, Sembène would have had to drive around in his van for 400 years to do that. So, and it's just, it's inspiring. You know, we were inspired by it for our own sake, but the idea that your story, you know, anyone's story from outside of this, you know, this very capital-intensive system of storytelling, traditionally. I mean, traditionally you needed to have a lot of money to make a movie and to show a movie. Now you can make a movie that's important to you, that's got some heart and soul on your phone. You can put it on YouTube and millions of people can see it. And it's an incredible moment for independent media. So, and this, this little experiment we did was just one, experiment out of many that are happening out in the world that are really inspiring. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, it's getting a little bit past my bedtime now that I'm 50. So
Only 50.
You look fresh.
So I just wanted to thank you for coming and thank the audience for coming out again to the sanctuary. Before we do before our last round of applause, of course, if anybody wants to stick around for a few minutes and have a little chat, we'll have a few minutes while we're packing things up. And there was a videotape being made tonight, so if anybody wants to see that in the future and reference the things that were said, that will be available. Also, I just want to remind you that we do have this capital campaign going on right now for the Nature Lab, the building that's going to be down the street. That's the Science Center. If anybody wants to put some effort into that in the future, either just with elbow grease, or if somebody in the room happens to be extremely wealthy and want to bankroll it, that would be great too. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.